My name is Elena Morrison, and I'll never forget the moment my ex-husband slid an envelope across the coffee shop table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 and a single sheet of paper. "Sign this, disappear from our lives, and the money's yours," he said, leaning back in his chair like he'd already won. What Derek didn't know was that 3 days later, everything he'd built on lies would come crashing down in the most spectacular way possible. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, from the day I thought I'd met my soulmate at a hospital fundraiser in Boston. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 7 years ago, I was a pediatric nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, working the overnight shift in the children's ward. My life revolved around sick kids who needed comfort, worried parents who needed reassurance, and the satisfaction of making a genuine difference in people's darkest moments. I loved everything about my job, from the chaos of emergency admissions to the quiet victories of watching a child finally go home healthy. My colleagues called me the baby whisperer because even the most inconsolable infants seemed to calm down when I held them. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but it filled me with purpose in a way nothing else ever had. The hospital's annual charity gala wasn't usually my scene. I preferred scrubs to evening gowns, and small talk with wealthy donors made me uncomfortable. But my best friend Rachel, who worked in hospital administration, had begged me to attend. "Elena, you need a life outside these walls," she'd insisted, practically forcing me into a borrowed dress. "When was the last time you went somewhere that didn't smell like antiseptic?" I'd reluctantly agreed, mostly to stop her nagging, never imagining that one evening would redirect the entire course of my existence. Derek Morrison stood near the silent auction tables, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He was a cardiovascular surgeon at a competing hospital, known in medical circles for his groundbreaking work with pediatric heart conditions. When our eyes met across the ballroom, he walked straight over with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of success. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he'd said with a knowing smile. "Same," I'd admitted, surprised by his candor. We spent the rest of the evening talking, ignoring the speeches and networking that was supposedly the point of attending. He told me about growing up in Connecticut as the son of 2 physicians, the pressure to excel, and how he'd found his calling in saving children's lives. I shared stories about my patients, the tiny fighters who inspired me daily, and my dream of one day working internationally with medical relief organizations. Our connection felt immediate and profound. Derek seemed to truly see me, not just as another nurse but as someone whose work mattered just as much as his own. He asked thoughtful questions about the emotional toll of pediatric nursing and listened intently when I described the families I'd helped through unimaginable crises. By the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers, and he'd already suggested dinner for the following weekend. Walking to my car, I'd felt a flutter of possibility that I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe Rachel had been right about needing more than just work in my life. The courtship that followed was intense and all-consuming. Derek pursued me with single-minded determination, sending flowers to the hospital, leaving thoughtful notes about articles he'd read that reminded him of our conversations, and planning dates that showed he'd been paying attention to everything I'd said. He took me to a small Italian restaurant I'd mentioned loving as a child, arranged a private tour of the Museum of Fine Arts because I'd casually mentioned my interest in Impressionist paintings, and surprised me with tickets to see a medical documentary I'd wanted to catch. Every gesture felt tailored specifically to me, making me feel uniquely special and understood. Within 4 months, Derek proposed during a weekend trip to Cape Cod. We'd been walking along the beach at sunset when he stopped, took both my hands, and told me he'd never met anyone who made him want to be a better person. The ring was a simple platinum band with a modest diamond, elegant without being ostentatious. "I know surgeons are supposed to have big egos," he'd said, sliding it onto my finger, "but you humble me every day with your compassion and strength. Will you marry me?" I'd said yes through happy tears, believing completely that we were building something real and lasting together. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a historic church in Beacon Hill with only close friends and family present. My parents, both retired teachers living modestly in New Hampshire, seemed slightly overwhelmed by Derek's family's obvious wealth but tried their best to fit in. His mother, Constance Morrison, was polite but distant, making subtle comments about the simplicity of the ceremony and asking pointed questions about my family's background. His father, Dr. Richard Morrison, barely spoke to anyone outside his own social circle, spending most of the reception on his phone discussing hospital politics. I'd brushed off the awkwardness, telling myself that families always had adjustment periods and that love would bridge any differences. Our first year of marriage unfolded like a carefully choreographed performance. Derek bought us a beautiful brownstone in Back Bay, a property that seemed impossibly luxurious to someone who'd spent her adult life in cramped apartments with multiple roommates. The house had original hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the rooms with natural light, and a garden that bloomed with hydrangeas every spring. I'd tried to contribute to the mortgage, but Derek had waved off my concerns. "Your salary barely covers your student loans," he'd said, not unkindly. "Let me handle the big expenses. You focus on your patients." At the time, it had seemed generous rather than controlling. I continued working my shifts at the hospital, though Derek started suggesting I might want to consider switching to day shifts or even part-time work. "The overnight schedule is aging you," he'd say, touching my face with concern. "You're exhausted all the time." He was right that the work was draining, but I loved the particular intimacy of night shifts, the quiet moments with scared children when the rest of the world slept. Still, I'd started to feel guilty about coming home at dawn, sleeping through the afternoon, and missing the evening hours when normal couples spent time together. When I discovered I was pregnant 18 months into our marriage, Derek's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. He'd lifted me off my feet, spinning me around our kitchen while talking about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery and how our child would have the best of everything. We spent weekends painting the room a soft yellow, assembling furniture, and imagining the life we'd give our baby. Those months felt like the happiest of my existence, filled with anticipation and shared dreams about the family we were creating together. Our daughter Sophia arrived on a rainy October morning after 16 hours of labor. The moment they placed her in my arms, sticky and screaming and absolutely perfect, I experienced a love so overwhelming it physically hurt. Derek had tears in his eyes as he held her tiny hand, promising to protect her always and give her opportunities he'd never had. For those first precious weeks, we were completely absorbed in our new reality, learning Sophia's rhythms and marveling at every small development. The cracks in our foundation started appearing gradually, so subtly that I almost didn't notice them at first. Derek began working longer hours, often sleeping at the hospital when he had early surgeries scheduled. He'd come home irritable and distant, barely acknowledging Sophia beyond a quick kiss on her head before retreating to his study. When I tried to discuss his absence, he'd respond with frustration about the pressure he was under, the lives depending on his skills, and how I couldn't possibly understand the weight of his responsibilities. "Not everyone gets to clock out and forget about work," he'd said during one argument. "Some of us carry it with us constantly." The comment had stung, reducing my nursing work to something insignificant compared to his surgical expertise. I'd started to second-guess myself, wondering if maybe I was being selfish by expecting more presence from someone doing such important work. My mother had raised me to be supportive of my partner, to understand that successful men needed space to operate at their highest level. So I'd swallowed my hurt and tried harder to make our home a peaceful sanctuary where Derek could decompress from his demanding career. When Sophia was 6 months old, Derek suggested I take a leave of absence from work. "She needs you right now," he'd said, bouncing her gently in his arms. "These early years are critical for attachment and development. Don't you want to be there for all her firsts?" The question had been loaded with judgment, implying that continuing to work meant prioritizing my career over our daughter's well-being. I'd felt torn between my identity as a nurse and my desire to be fully present for Sophia's infancy. After weeks of agonizing, I'd requested an extended unpaid leave, telling myself it was temporary and that I'd return once she was older. Stepping away from nursing felt like losing a limb. My entire adult identity had been built around caring for sick children and supporting families through medical crises. Without that daily purpose, I felt adrift and hollow. I threw myself into motherhood with desperate intensity, attending every baby class available, organizing elaborate developmental activities, and documenting Sophia's every milestone in detailed journals. But the isolation was crushing. My work friends gradually stopped calling, their lives filled with shift changes and hospital drama that I no longer shared. The other mothers in our wealthy neighborhood seemed to exist in a different universe, discussing nanny services and vacation properties while I tried to remember who I'd been before becoming someone's wife and mother. Derek's behavior became increasingly controlling in ways I didn't fully recognize until much later. He questioned my purchases, even small things like a new book or coffee from my favorite shop. "We need to watch our spending," he'd say, despite his six-figure salary and the obvious wealth his family possessed. He criticized my appearance, suggesting I'd let myself go after pregnancy and should make more effort to look put together. He monitored my phone, asking who I'd been texting and why I needed to maintain friendships with former colleagues. Each criticism chipped away at my confidence until I started to believe his assessment that I was lucky he'd chosen me despite my obvious shortcomings. The financial control became absolute when Derek opened a separate account for household expenses and gave me a debit card with a monthly limit. "This will help you budget better," he'd explained, as if I were a child who couldn't manage money despite having supported myself for years before marriage. Any purchase beyond groceries and basic necessities required his approval. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I'd needed new shoes after mine had literally fallen apart, I'd had to send him photos and prices for his agreement. The humiliation of asking permission to buy basic necessities was degrading in ways I couldn't articulate even to myself. Sophia's second birthday party was the last time I saw Derek interact with our daughter with any real warmth. He'd taken the day off, played with her in the garden, and acted like the devoted father I'd believed he was when I married him. But the very next week, he announced he'd accepted a position as chief of cardiovascular surgery at a prestigious hospital in Manhattan. "We're moving to New York in 3 months, he'd stated, not asked. When I'd protested about leaving my parents, my few remaining friends, and the city I'd always called home, he'd dismissed my concerns entirely. "This is a career-defining opportunity," he'd said coldly. "If you can't be supportive, maybe we need to reconsider this entire arrangement." The threat had hung in the air between us, unspoken but clear. He could leave me with nothing if I didn't comply. So I'd swallowed my objections and began the process of dismantling the life I'd built, packing up our home and preparing to follow Derek to a city where I knew no one and had no support system whatsoever. My mother had cried when I told her, seeing through Derek's manipulation even when I couldn't fully acknowledge it myself. "Elena, sweetheart, this isn't what partnership looks like," she'd said gently. But I defended him, insisting he was just driven and ambitious, that I needed to be more understanding of the sacrifices required for his success. New York was lonely in ways Boston had never been. Derek's new position consumed him completely, leaving him at the hospital 16 hours a day and sometimes overnight. I was trapped in our luxury apartment on the Upper East Side with a toddler, no car, and no idea how to navigate the overwhelming city beyond our immediate neighborhood. I tried to make friends at the local playground, but the other mothers seemed to sense my desperation and kept their distance. Sophia and I spent our days in an endless loop of parks, libraries, and child-friendly museums, filling time until Derek might come home and acknowledge our existence. The discovery of Derek's affair came not through dramatic confrontation but through mundane carelessness. He'd left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a message notification had popped up on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I've missed you so much these past few days." The sender was Dr. Amanda Chen, a cardiac fellow working under Derek at the hospital. My hands had trembled as I'd scrolled through months of messages, each one revealing the depth of their relationship. They'd been sleeping together since before we'd moved to New York, possibly since before Sophia's birthday. The betrayal wasn't just sexual but emotional, with Derek sharing intimate thoughts with Amanda that he'd never expressed to me. When Derek emerged from the shower, I'd confronted him with the evidence pulled up on his screen. His reaction wasn't denial or apology but annoyance at being caught. "What did you expect, Elena?" he'd said, toweling his hair casually. "You've become completely focused on Sophia, totally unavailable emotionally and physically. Amanda understands the pressures I'm under in ways you never could." The blame had been instant and complete, transforming his infidelity into my failure as a wife. I'd stood there in shock, holding our sleeping daughter, while the man I'd pledged my life to rewrote our entire history to justify his betrayal. The divorce he filed for the following week was ruthlessly efficient. His attorney, Mitchell Blackwood from one of Manhattan's most aggressive firms, had clearly been preparing the groundwork for months. The petition painted me as an unstable, unemployed dependent with no means of supporting myself or Sophia. It requested full custody with supervised visitation for me, characterizing my leave from nursing as evidence of mental instability rather than the choice Derek had pressured me into making. Every private moment of vulnerability I'd shared with him had been documented and weaponized, from postpartum struggles to the depression I'd confessed during our loneliest New York nights. Derek moved out immediately, taking only his personal belongings and leaving me in the apartment with Sophia but no access to funds. The joint account was emptied, the household card was cancelled, and I was left with exactly $347 in my personal checking account. When I'd called him in panic about how to feed our daughter, he'd said coldly, "Figure it out. That's what adults do." The cruelty was breathtaking, especially from someone who'd sworn to love and protect me. My parents sent what little they could spare, but their retirement income barely covered their own expenses. I'd applied for emergency assistance but was told I didn't qualify because technically I was still married to someone with substantial income, despite having no access to it. I'd pawned my wedding ring, the modest jewelry Derek had given me over the years, and anything else of value just to cover groceries and diapers. The luxury apartment felt like a prison, beautiful but suffocating, a constant reminder of everything I'd lost. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Derek had filed for divorce. His tone had been almost friendly when he'd suggested we meet for coffee to discuss our situation like civilized adults. Desperate for any sign that he might be willing to negotiate fairly, I'd agreed immediately. I'd arranged for a neighbor I'd recently befriended to watch Sophia, put on the least wrinkled clothes I owned, and taken the subway to the upscale coffee shop Derek had specified in Midtown. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table in an expensive suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. The envelope was already on the table between us, thick and official looking. "I've been thinking about our situation," Derek had started, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "This divorce is going to be ugly and expensive for both of us. I have a proposal that could make things easier." He'd slid the envelope across the table with that unsettling smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. Inside was the cashier's check for $50,000 and a single-page agreement. The terms were simple and devastating. In exchange for the money, I would relinquish all parental rights to Sophia, agree never to contact Derek or our daughter again, and sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing our marriage or divorce with anyone. I would essentially disappear from their lives as if I'd never existed. $50,000 should be enough to get you back on your feet," Derek had said, sipping his espresso casually. "You can move back to New Hampshire, restart your nursing career, build a new life. Sophia won't even remember you in a few years. Kids are resilient like that." He'd leaned forward, his expression almost sympathetic. "Face it, Elena. You're broke, unemployed, and going up against my legal team. This custody fight will destroy what little you have left. Take the money. It's more than generous considering you brought nothing to this marriage." The words had landed like physical blows. He was offering me money to abandon my daughter, to voluntarily disappear so he could rewrite our family history without the inconvenience of my existence. The assumption that I was desperate enough to accept, that maternal love could be purchased for the price of a used car, revealed how little he'd ever truly known me. I'd looked at that check, at the agreement that would sever me from Sophia forever, and felt something shift inside my chest. "No," I'd said quietly, pushing the envelope back across the table. Derek's expression had hardened immediately. "Elena, don't be stupid. This is the best offer you're going to get. My mother has already agreed to help raise Sophia. She'll have every advantage, the best schools, travel, opportunities you could never provide. Stop being selfish and think about what's actually best for her." I'd stood up, my legs shaking but my voice steady. "What's best for Sophia is having her mother in her life. I don't care how much money you throw at this or how many lawyers you hire. You're not taking my daughter." The walk out of that coffee shop was the longest of my life, my heart pounding with the terrifying knowledge that I'd just declared war against someone with infinite resources and absolutely no conscience. 3 days after that meeting, everything Derek had carefully constructed began to collapse in ways neither of us could have predicted. The evening after I rejected Derek's offer, I sat in the dimming light of our apartment trying to figure out my next move. Sophia was finally asleep after a difficult bedtime routine where she'd asked repeatedly when Daddy was coming home. Each question had pierced my heart because I knew Derek had no intention of maintaining any real relationship with her beyond what served his image. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "This is Jennifer Reeves. I worked with Derek at Mass General. We need to talk. Can you meet tomorrow morning?" I'd vaguely remembered Jennifer, a surgical nurse who'd left the hospital abruptly about 2 years into my relationship with Derek. I'd never known the full story, just whispered conversations that stopped whenever I entered the break room. Something about a complaint she'd filed that had been quietly buried by hospital administration. My hands trembled as I typed back agreeing to meet at a diner near my apartment the following day. Jennifer arrived exactly on time, a tall woman in her early 40s with tired eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades in operating rooms. She ordered coffee and got straight to the point. "I heard through the medical community grapevine that Derek is divorcing you and going for full custody," she said, stirring sugar into her cup methodically. "I also heard he offered you money to disappear." When I confirmed both pieces of information, she nodded grimly. "That's exactly what he tried with me, though the circumstances were different." The story Jennifer told over the next 2 hours fundamentally altered my understanding of the man I'd married. 6 years ago, she'd been one of Derek's primary surgical nurses, working closely with him on complex pediatric heart cases. He'd been charming and attentive, gradually crossing professional boundaries with lingering touches and inappropriate comments. When she'd firmly rejected his advances, he'd become vindictive, undermining her work in front of colleagues and filing complaints about her competence. The harassment had escalated until she'd finally reported him to Human Resources. Derek's family connections and reputation had protected him completely. His father, Dr. Richard Morrison, sat on the hospital's board of directors and had personal relationships with every administrator. The complaint had been investigated by people who had no interest in finding their star surgeon guilty of misconduct. Jennifer had been offered a settlement, money to resign quietly and sign a non-disclosure agreement. She'd been broke, supporting elderly parents, and had reluctantly accepted. "I've regretted it every day since," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I let him get away with it, and I've watched him continue doing the same thing to other women." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of documents she'd secretly kept despite the NDA, performance reviews that had been stellar before she rejected Derek's advances and mysteriously terrible afterward, emails where he'd made inappropriate comments, and most damning, a photograph of bruises on her arm from an incident where he'd grabbed her during an argument in a supply closet. "I know 2 other women who had similar experiences with him," Jennifer said. "One at his current hospital in New York. I've been quietly documenting his pattern for years, waiting for the right moment to use this information." My mind reeled trying to reconcile this predatory picture with the man who'd courted me so carefully. But pieces started clicking into place: his need for absolute control, his rage when challenged, the way he'd systematically isolated me from any support system. Jennifer must have seen the recognition dawning on my face. "Elena, men like Derek are expert manipulators," she said gently. "They choose targets carefully, love-bomb them into submission, then gradually reveal their true nature once their victim is trapped. You're not stupid for not seeing it. You're human, and he's had a lifetime of practice." She explained that she'd been waiting for someone with standing to challenge Derek legally, someone he'd harmed in a way that couldn't be easily dismissed or buried. A divorce and custody case, especially one involving his own daughter, would require public records and testimony that his family couldn't completely control. If I was willing to fight, Jennifer and the other women would come forward despite their NDAs, risking legal consequences to finally hold Derek accountable for years of abuse. The decision should have been difficult, but sitting there looking at evidence of Derek's systematic cruelty, I felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just about my custody of Sophia anymore. This was about stopping someone who'd been hurting people for decades with complete impunity. What do I need to do? I asked. Jennifer smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from her. First, we get you a lawyer who actually gives a damn. I know someone. The attorney Jennifer connected me with was Victoria Santos, a family law specialist who'd built her reputation taking on powerful men in high-profile divorces. Her office was modest compared to the marble and mahogany of Derek's legal team, located in a building in Queens that had seen better days. But Victoria herself was formidable, a Puerto Rican woman in her 50s who'd worked her way through law school while raising 3 kids alone. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking detailed notes and occasionally shaking her head in disgust. Your husband is a textbook narcissistic abuser, Victoria said when I finished. Every move has been calculated to destroy your sense of self and make you dependent. The good news is that judges have seen this pattern before, and we can use his own tactics against him. She explained that Derek's offer of money to relinquish parental rights was actually illegal in New York, essentially attempting to buy a child. The existence of that offer alone could seriously damage his custody case if we could prove it happened. The problem was evidence. I hadn't recorded our conversation, and Derek would simply deny it ever occurred. But Victoria had a strategy. He thinks you're desperate and defeated, she said, a calculating gleam in her eye. Let's use that assumption. Contact him again, say you're reconsidering his offer but need time to think. If we can get him to put anything in writing or make the offer again with witnesses present, we have him. I'd gone home that night and crafted a carefully worded text message that made me sick to send. Derek, I've been thinking about your offer. You might be right that Sophia would be better off with stability. Can we meet again to discuss details? His response came within minutes. I knew you'd see reason. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., same place. The casual cruelty in his certainty that I'd sell my daughter cut deep, but I held on to the knowledge that his arrogance would be his downfall. Victoria arranged for a private investigator to be present at the coffee shop, someone who could document the meeting without Derek's knowledge. She'd also prepared me with a recording device hidden in my purse, legal in New York as a one-party consent state. When I arrived at the coffee shop the next afternoon, Derek was already there with the same envelope, clearly confident this was a done deal. I'm glad you've decided to be smart about this, he'd said, pushing the envelope toward me again. Amanda and I have already started planning the wedding. It'll be easier for everyone if Sophia doesn't have the confusion of going back and forth between households. The casual mention of marrying his mistress while discussing buying off his current wife would have been laughable if it weren't so grotesque. I'd forced myself to play the role of defeated woman considering her options. $50,000 doesn't seem like very much to rebuild an entire life, I'd said softly, letting my voice shake. I'd need money for housing, professional licensing renewals, maybe some additional training since I'd been out of nursing for a while. Derek had leaned back, studying me with the expression of someone negotiating a business deal. How much are you thinking? The conversation that followed, all carefully recorded, was Derek at his most revealing. He'd offered $75,000, then $90,000 when I'd hesitated, each increase accompanied by more details about why Sophia would be better off without me. He'd mentioned his mother's connections to elite preschools, the trust fund he'd establish, the life of privilege his daughter deserved. Most damning, he'd explicitly stated, you sign over all parental rights, you never contact us again, and this money sets you up somewhere far from New York. Maybe you go back to New Hampshire, maybe you start over somewhere completely new. Either way, you're out of our lives permanently. When I'd asked what would happen if I changed my mind after signing, Derek's mask had slipped completely. The agreement is ironclad. You'd have no legal standing whatsoever. And if you tried to cause problems, I'd make sure you regretted it. I have resources you can't even imagine, Elena. I could destroy whatever pathetic life you tried to build. The threat had been delivered calmly, matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather rather than promising to ruin me. I'd left that meeting with everything we needed. The recording was clear, Derek's voice unmistakable as he attempted to purchase parental rights and threatened retaliation. Victoria had been ecstatic when I'd played it for her. This changes everything, she'd said. Not only is this illegal, it speaks directly to his character and fitness as a parent. A man willing to buy his way out of co-parenting isn't concerned with his child's best interests. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer's network of women Derek had harassed reached out through Victoria, and one of them worked in the administrative offices of Derek's current hospital. Dr. Sarah Kim had been a cardiology resident when Derek had targeted her 2 years ago, using his position as department chief to pressure her into a relationship. When she'd refused, he'd systematically sabotaged her evaluations and recommendations, nearly destroying her career before she'd transferred to another program. Sarah had kept meticulous records of everything, emails where Derek had made inappropriate comments thinly disguised as professional correspondence, text messages where he'd alternated between love bombing and intimidation, witness statements from other residents who'd observed his behavior. More importantly, she had documentation of complaints filed against Derek by multiple women over the years, all of which had been quietly settled or dismissed through his family's influence. Victoria filed an emergency motion to modify the custody arrangement based on new evidence of Derek's character and pattern of abusive behavior. The motion included the recording of Derek's illegal offer, testimony from Jennifer and Sarah about his harassment, and a request for a full investigation into his fitness as a parent. Derek's attorney, Mitchell Blackwood, had responded with predictable aggression, filing motions to suppress evidence and attacking the credibility of every witness. But the recording was admissible, and the pattern it revealed was impossible to dismiss. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I'd spent every moment preparing with Victoria. She'd coached me on staying calm under cross-examination, on answering only what was asked, on remembering that truth was our strongest weapon. The night before the hearing, my mother had called from New Hampshire, her voice thick with worry. "Sweetheart, are you sure about this fight? Men like Derek don't lose gracefully." I'd looked at Sophia sleeping peacefully in her crib, one small hand clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "I'm sure, Mom. If I don't fight now, I'm teaching her that powerful men can do whatever they want without consequences. I won't let that be the lesson she learns from this." My mother had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "Your father would be so proud of you." "I'm proud of you. Whatever happens, you're doing the right thing." The family courthouse in Manhattan was an imposing building of glass and steel, designed to intimidate with its cold efficiency. I'd arrived early with Victoria, both of us carrying boxes of documentation and evidence. Derek sat at the opposing table with Mitchell and 2 associate attorneys, an overwhelming show of legal force meant to communicate the resources arrayed against me. He'd barely glanced in my direction, his expression one of bored confidence that this was merely an inconvenient formality. Judge Patricia O'Connor entered, and the courtroom fell silent. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and a reputation for no-nonsense rulings that prioritized children's welfare above parental ego. Victoria had researched her extensively and believed we had a fair shot at getting a hearing that focused on facts rather than resources. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding emergency custody modification in the matter of Morrison versus Morrison," Judge O'Connor announced. "I've reviewed the initial filings. This appears to be more complex than a standard divorce proceeding." Mitchell stood, his expensive suit and practiced charm on full display. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of an unemployed, emotionally unstable mother attempting to interfere with a father's legitimate custody rights. The evidence Mrs. Morrison's attorney plans to present is irrelevant character assassination designed to distract from her own inadequacies as a parent." He proceeded to outline Derek's accomplishments, his standing in the medical community, his financial stability, painting a picture of the ideal father being unfairly attacked. When Victoria stood for our opening, her voice was steady and clear. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Dr. Morrison has engaged in a pattern of manipulation, harassment, and illegal behavior that directly speaks to his fitness as a parent. This is not character assassination but documented fact. We have recordings, testimony, and a trail of victims spanning years. The emergency motion is necessary to protect the minor child from a father who views her as property to be acquired rather than a person to be loved." The first piece of evidence Victoria presented was the recording of Derek's offer. The courtroom fell silent as his voice filled the space, offering money for parental rights and threatening me if I ever tried to maintain contact with Sophia. I'd watched Derek's face as the recording played, seeing his jaw tighten and his hands clench, the first crack in his composed facade. Mitchell had objected immediately, calling it entrapment and inadmissible, but Judge O'Connor had overruled, noting that one-party consent recordings were legal in New York and directly relevant to the case. Jennifer Reeves was called to testify next. She'd walked to the stand with visible nervousness, clearly aware she was violating her NDA and risking legal consequences. Under Victoria's questioning, she described her experience working with Derek, his harassment, the hospital's cover-up, and the settlement that had silenced her. "I signed that agreement because I was broke and scared," she testified. "But I've regretted it every day since. Women deserve to know who they're working with, and children deserve to know who's raising them." Mitchell's cross-examination had been vicious, attacking Jennifer's credibility by pointing out she'd violated a legal agreement and suggesting her testimony was motivated by bitterness rather than truth. But Jennifer had held firm, her answers consistent and detailed, supported by the documentation she'd secretly maintained. When Mitchell had suggested she'd misinterpreted Derek's behavior as harassment, she'd responded with icy precision. "I've been a surgical nurse for 23 years. I know the difference between professional interaction and a man who won't take no for an answer." Dr. Sarah Kim testified next, describing her experience as a resident under Derek's supervision. Her testimony was particularly powerful because she'd had no connection to me or the divorce proceedings, no possible motivation beyond preventing Derek from harming others. She detailed the progression of his inappropriate behavior, the retaliation when she'd refused his advances, and the documented impact on her career evaluations. Dr. Morrison uses his position and reputation as weapons, she'd testified. He targets women in vulnerable positions and punishes them when they don't comply with his demands. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted palpably as the evidence mounted. Derek's confident expression had been replaced by barely controlled fury, his whispered conversations with Mitchell growing more heated. Judge O'Connor had been taking extensive notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that suggested she was taking the allegations seriously. When Victoria had requested permission to submit additional testimony from 3 other women with similar experiences, Mitchell had practically shouted his objection. "Your Honor, this has become a witch hunt against my client," Mitchell had argued. "None of this alleged behavior has any bearing on Dr. Morrison's relationship with his daughter. We're not here to litigate his professional conduct or his personal life. We're here to determine custody arrangements, and Mrs. Morrison has presented zero evidence that Dr. Morrison has been anything but a loving father." Victoria had been ready for this argument. "Your Honor, a parent's character absolutely bears on custody determinations. A man who systematically abuses power, manipulates women, and breaks laws when convenient demonstrates a pattern of behavior that endangers any child in his care. The minor child in this case is a girl who will one day be a woman. Does this court really want to award custody to a man with a documented history of harassing and threatening women?" Judge O'Connor had called a recess to review the evidence, leaving both sides in tense silence. I'd sat in the hallway with Victoria, trying to process what had just happened. In the span of a few hours, Derek's carefully constructed image had been systematically dismantled. The powerful surgeon who'd seemed untouchable was being exposed as a predator who'd used his family's influence to escape accountability for years. When court reconvened, Derek himself was called to testify. Mitchell had clearly tried to prepare him, but Derek's arrogance made him a terrible witness. Under Victoria's cross-examination, he'd been defensive and condescending, unable to maintain the charm that usually got him through difficult situations. When asked about the recorded conversation, he'd insisted it was taken out of context, that he'd been trying to help me move on with my life. "Dr. Morrison, you offered your wife $90,000 to permanently relinquish all parental rights to your daughter," Victoria had stated. "In what context is purchasing a child helpful?" Derek had fumbled for an answer, finally settling on, "Sophia deserves stability," and Elena was clearly struggling. "I was providing an option that would benefit everyone." The response had been exactly what Victoria wanted, Derek characterizing his daughter's relationship with her mother as optional if the price was right. Victoria had pressed further. "You stated in the recording that if Mrs. Morrison tried to maintain contact after signing the agreement, you would destroy whatever life she tried to build. Can you explain what you meant by that?" Derek's face had flushed with anger. "That was a figure of speech. Elena has a tendency to be dramatic and create problems. I simply meant there would be legal consequences for violating an agreement. The cross-examination had continued with Victoria systematically walking through each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, forcing Derek to either admit wrongdoing or provide increasingly implausible alternative explanations. By the time she'd finished, Derek was visibly rattled, his composed demeanor completely shattered. Mitchell had attempted redirect to rehabilitate his client, but the damage was irreversible. My own testimony had been brief but powerful. Victoria had asked me to describe my relationship with Sophia, our daily routine, the bond we'd built. I'd spoken honestly about the challenges of single parenthood, my determination to return to nursing, and my commitment to providing Sophia with love and stability despite limited financial resources. When Mitchell had cross-examined me about my employment gap, I'd been ready. "You chose to leave your career," he'd stated accusingly. "That was your decision, not my client's." I'd looked him directly in the eye. "Your client pressured me to quit working by suggesting it was selfish to prioritize my career over our daughter's needs. He controlled our finances, making me completely dependent on him. When I expressed interest in returning to nursing, he dismissed it. These weren't my independent choices. They were decisions made under coercion and manipulation." Mitchell had tried to shake my composure with questions about my financial situation, my modest apartment, my reliance on my parents for support. But Victoria had prepared me well, and I'd answered each question calmly, acknowledging challenges while emphasizing my active efforts to overcome them. When he'd suggested I was an unstable influence on Sophia, I'd responded with the truth. "The only instability in my daughter's life has been caused by her father's choices. I've provided consistency, love, and security despite every obstacle he's placed in my path." As my testimony concluded, I'd felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever Judge O'Connor decided, I'd told the truth completely and fought with everything I had. Sophia would one day know that her mother had never given up, never accepted money to disappear, never stopped believing she was worth fighting for. That knowledge alone made the entire ordeal worthwhile. The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Mitchell had doubled down on Derek's accomplishments and resources, arguing that Sophia deserved the advantages only he could provide. Victoria had focused on character and fitness, summarizing the pattern of abuse and manipulation that made Derek fundamentally unsuited for sole custody. Judge O'Connor had listened impassively to both sides before announcing she would issue a ruling within 48 hours. Those 48 hours were the longest of my life. I'd existed in a state of suspended anxiety, unable to eat or sleep properly, constantly checking my phone for updates from Victoria. My mother had driven down from New Hampshire to stay with me, watching Sophia while I paced our small apartment rehearsing every possible outcome. The night before the ruling was due, I'd finally broken down crying in my mother's arms, all the fear and exhaustion I'd been holding back flooding out. "Whatever happens, you've been so brave," my mother had whispered, stroking my hair like she had when I was young. "You've shown Sophia what real strength looks like, what fighting for what matters really means. That's a gift that will last her entire life, sweetheart." Her words had steadied me enough to face whatever came next. The call from Victoria came at 9 in the morning. "The ruling is in," she'd said, her voice carefully neutral. "We need to be in court at 2 this afternoon." The hours between that call and the court appearance passed in a blur. I'd dressed carefully in a simple blue dress my mother had helped me press, pulled my hair back neatly, and tried to look like someone deserving of custody despite my shaking hands. Document at the courtroom was packed when we arrived, far more crowded than the preliminary hearing had been. Word had spread through the medical community about the case, and several people I didn't recognize sat in the gallery observing. Derek was already at his table with Mitchell, his expression unreadable but his posture rigid with tension. When Judge O'Connor entered, the entire room fell into absolute silence. She settled behind the bench and opened the file before her, taking a moment to survey the courtroom before speaking. "I have reviewed all evidence presented, all testimony given, and all legal arguments made in the matter of Morrison versus Morrison. This case has required careful consideration of competing interests and complex questions of parental fitness." My heart hammered so hard I could barely hear her next words. Judge O'Connor continued in her measured tone. "Dr. Morrison presents himself as a stable provider with substantial resources to offer his daughter. These factors are relevant in custody determinations. However, this court has serious concerns about his character and judgment based on evidence presented. She detailed the recording of Derek's illegal offer, the pattern of harassment documented by multiple witnesses, and his demonstrated willingness to use threats and manipulation to achieve his goals. A parent who attempts to purchase custody rights demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of what parenthood requires. Children are not acquisitions to be bought or controlled. They are human beings deserving of love, respect, and stability that comes from genuine commitment rather than financial resources. Judge O'Connor then addressed me directly. Mrs. Morrison has faced significant challenges, many of which were directly caused or exacerbated by Dr. Morrison's actions. However, the evidence shows consistent dedication to her daughter's well-being, active efforts to rebuild her career and financial stability, and genuine maternal bond. The testimony from educators and medical professionals supports that the minor child is thriving under her mother's care despite limited resources. The judge paused, and in that silence my entire future hung suspended. Therefore, this court grants primary physical custody to Elena Morrison. Dr. Morrison will have supervised visitation rights pending completion of a psychological evaluation and parenting course. Furthermore, Dr. Morrison is ordered to pay child support in accordance with New York State guidelines and must immediately cease all contact with Mrs. Morrison except through attorneys or court-approved mediators. The words took a moment to penetrate my shock. I had one. Sophia would stay with me. Victoria grabbed my hand under the table, squeezing it hard while maintaining her professional composure. Behind me, I heard my mother's quiet sob of relief. Across the aisle, Derek had gone pale, leaning toward Mitchell in urgent conversation. Judge O'Connor wasn't finished. Additionally, this court is referring the evidence of workplace harassment to the appropriate medical licensing boards and the hospitals where Dr. Morrison has practiced. The pattern documented here suggests violations of professional ethics that warrant investigation beyond this custody proceeding. The implications were devastating for Derek. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built could crumble from this referral. Mitchell stood immediately, requesting appeal and emergency stay, but Judge O'Connor denied both. This ruling is effective immediately. Mrs. Morrison will retain physical custody while any appeals are processed. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the suddenly noisy courtroom. I sat frozen for a moment, unable to fully process what had just happened. Victoria pulled me to my feet, her professional mask finally cracking into a genuine smile. You did it, Elena. You actually did it. My mother reached us then, wrapping both of us in a fierce hug while tears streamed down her face. Around us, Jennifer and Sarah were celebrating quietly, their own vindication finally achieved after years of silence. Derek stormed out of the courtroom without looking at me, Mitchell trailing behind him making urgent phone calls. I watched him go, feeling not triumph but a strange sadness for what could have been if he'd been the man I thought I'd married. But that man had never existed. The real Derek was the one exposed in this courtroom, and Sophia deserved better than growing up under his controlling influence. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered after word spread about the high-profile surgeon's custody loss. Cameras flashed as we emerged, and microphones were thrust toward us. Victoria had prepared me for this possibility, coaching me on keeping statements brief and dignified. Today justice was served for my daughter, I said simply. That's all I have to say. Victoria shepherded us through the crowd to a waiting car, her protective presence a shield against the chaos. The ride back to my apartment felt surreal, like I was floating outside my body watching someone else's victory. My mother sat beside me holding my hand, occasionally squeezing it as if to confirm this was real. When we finally arrived home, the neighbor who'd been watching Sophia brought her to the door. My daughter ran into my arms, completely unaware that her entire future had just been secured. "Mommy, did you win?" she asked innocently, repeating words she'd heard adults say without understanding their weight. I buried my face in her hair, breathing in the sweet scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Yes, baby. Mommy won. We both won." That night, after Sophia fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, I sat alone in our small living room and finally allowed myself to feel the full magnitude of what had happened. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment and rebuilding. Derek's psychological evaluation revealed narcissistic personality traits and control issues that supported supervised visitation. The evaluator's report detailed his inability to acknowledge wrongdoing, his pattern of blaming others for his choices, and concerning attitudes about women and power dynamics. The court-appointed psychologist had recommended extensive therapy before unsupervised contact with Sophia could be considered. His first supervised visit with Sophia took place at a family center designed for such interactions. I dropped her off with trepidation, worried about how the encounter might affect her. The supervisor later told me that Derek had spent most of the 2-hour visit on his phone, barely engaging with Sophia's attempts to show him drawings she'd made. When she'd asked him to play with her dolls, he declined, saying he didn't understand those kinds of games. The visit lasted exactly 20 minutes before he left, apparently unable to handle the presence of a court-appointed monitor documenting his every interaction. After that, his visits became sporadic and eventually stopped altogether. The supervised visitation center would call to confirm his scheduled time, and Derek would cancel at the last minute with vague excuses about surgical emergencies or important meetings. Sophia stopped asking when she'd see Daddy, her young mind adapting to his absence with the resilience of childhood. I'd worried about the psychological impact, but her therapist assured me that consistent, loving care from me was far more important than sporadic contact with a parent who couldn't show up emotionally. Amanda, his fiancée, left him when the full scope of his harassment history became public knowledge. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd been genuinely shocked by the revelations, having believed Derek's portrayal of me as an unstable ex-wife making false accusations. The reality documented in court records had shattered her illusions. She'd reached out once through a mutual friend, apologizing for her role in Derek's attempt to take Sophia. I'd appreciated the gesture but had no interest in maintaining contact with anyone from that chapter of my life. The medical board investigations proceeded methodically, interviewing dozens of women who'd worked with Derek over the years. Once Jennifer and Sarah had broken their silence publicly, others felt empowered to come forward with their own stories. The pattern that emerged was damning enough that his hospital placed him on administrative leave pending their own internal review. His privileges were suspended at 2 other hospitals where he'd had consulting positions. The career he'd built through talent and family connections was unraveling thread by thread. His mother Constance called me once, her voice cold and clipped, suggesting I was ruining a good man's life out of spite. Derek made mistakes, but this vindictive campaign you've orchestrated is destroying him, she'd said, her tone dripping with accusation. Whatever problems you had in your marriage, this punishment is excessive. You've taken his daughter, his career, his reputation. Are you satisfied now? Her inability to see Derek's actions as anything but mistakes, her characterization of consequences as punishment, her suggestion that I was the vindictive one after everything her son had done, crystallized exactly where Derek had learned his sense of entitlement. I'd responded calmly, my voice steady despite my racing heart. Your son tried to buy custody of his own child. He harassed and threatened multiple women over years. He used his position to destroy careers when women rejected him. These aren't mistakes, Constance. They're patterns of abuse that you enabled by making excuses and using your family's influence to cover them up. I'm done being blamed for his choices. I'd hung up on her mid-sentence, finally free from the need to prove myself to people who would never see my worth. The liberation of that moment, refusing to accept blame for someone else's destruction of their own life, marked a turning point in my healing. I'd spent too many years apologizing for existing, for having needs, for not being whatever Derek wanted me to be. Those days were over. I returned to nursing with a renewed sense of purpose, taking a position in the pediatric oncology ward at a community hospital in Queens. The work was heartbreaking and beautiful, exactly what I'd been missing during my years away. The children fighting cancer had a particular kind of courage that humbled me daily. Their families reminded me that real struggle looked like watching your child endure chemotherapy, not like Derek's manufactured grievances about being held accountable. My colleagues welcomed me warmly, and I discovered that the gap in my resume didn't matter as much as my passion for the work. The head nurse, Patricia Chen, was particularly supportive, sharing her own story of rebuilding her career after a difficult divorce. You're going to be amazing here, she'd said during my first week. I can already see how the kids respond to you. She'd been right. Within weeks, I'd become the nurse parents requested specifically, the one who could get IVs started on the toughest sticks, who knew exactly how to distract a terrified child during procedures, who sat with families during the darkest moments. Sophia adjusted to our new routine beautifully, attending a wonderful preschool near the hospital where she made friends and thrived. Her teacher, Miss Rebecca, had pulled me aside after the first week to tell me what a joy Sophia was in class. She's empathetic beyond her years, Rebecca had observed. Yesterday, another child was crying because their mom was late for pickup, and Sophia sat with him the entire time, holding his hand and telling him it would be okay. You're raising a special little girl. The financial situation remained tight but manageable. Child support payments arrived consistently through the court system, monitored to ensure Derek couldn't use money as a control mechanism. I'd opened a savings account for Sophia's future, adding small amounts each month and watching it grow slowly but steadily. We couldn't afford vacations or expensive activities, but we had stability, which felt more valuable than any luxury I'd experienced during my marriage. The $50,000 Derek had offered me to disappear would have solved immediate financial problems but cost me everything that mattered. I thought about that envelope sometimes, about how different our lives might have been if I'd taken the money and signed away my rights. Sophia would have grown up in Derek's controlled environment, learning that love was conditional and power was everything. She would have believed her mother hadn't wanted her, had chosen money over her. The psychological damage of that narrative made any temporary financial relief seem insignificant. The choice to fight instead led to struggles and uncertainty, late nights working extra shifts and budgeting every dollar carefully. But it also led to freedom, self-respect, and the knowledge that Sophia would grow up watching her mother stand firm for what was right rather than accept money to abandon her principles. Some lessons couldn't be taught through words alone. They required living examples of courage and integrity. Jennifer, Sarah, and the other women who'd testified became unexpected friends, our shared experience creating bonds of understanding and support. We started meeting monthly for dinner, celebrating each other's victories and providing solidarity during setbacks. Jennifer had finally found peace, her years of silent guilt transformed into pride at having helped stop Derek's pattern of abuse. She'd started volunteering with an organization that helped women navigate workplace harassment, using her experience to guide others through similar situations. Sarah was thriving in her new cardiology program, her career back on track after Derek's sabotage had nearly destroyed it. She'd published research that was getting attention in medical journals, establishing her own reputation independent of Derek's shadow. At one of our dinners, she'd raised her glass in a toast to surviving men who tried to destroy us and coming out stronger on the other side. We'd all clinked glasses, a group of women who'd faced down power and won. My relationship with my mother deepened in ways I hadn't expected. She'd seen me at my lowest and never wavered in her support, offering help without judgment and wisdom without condescension. She visited often, delighting in watching Sophia grow and develop into a confident, joyful child. Sometimes we talked about my father, the lessons learned from his abandonment, and how generational patterns could be broken by conscious choice and courage. "You're braver than I ever was," my mother had said during one visit, watching Sophia play in the small park near our apartment. "When your father left, I just accepted it, told myself I deserved it somehow. You fought back. You demanded better." I'd squeezed her hand, understanding that healing sometimes came through watching the next generation do what you couldn't. Her support of my fight had been part of her own journey towards self-respect. 6 months after the custody ruling, I ran into Derek's mother at a medical charity event I'd been invited to through the hospital. Constance looked older, the strain of her son's public disgrace visible in new lines around her eyes and gray roots showing through her usually perfect hair. She'd approached me hesitantly, surprising me with genuine emotion in her voice that I'd never heard before. "I owe you an apology," she'd said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one could overhear our conversation. I raised Derek to believe success and status were more important than character. I protected him from consequences his entire life, made excuses for behavior I knew was wrong. I see now what that created. Her voice had cracked slightly. "He's lost everything, and I realize it's because I never taught him that people aren't objects to be manipulated. I'm sorry for what he did to you, and I'm sorry for enabling it. I'd accepted her apology with guarded grace, understanding that her reckoning was separate from my own healing. I appreciate you saying that, Constance. I hope Derek gets the help he needs. She nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. May I see Sophia sometime? I know I don't deserve it, but she's my only grandchild. I'd promised to consider it, unwilling to make decisions in the moment but recognizing that Sophia might benefit from a relationship with her grandmother if Constance had genuinely changed. Derek himself had taken a position at a smaller hospital in a rural area of Pennsylvania, his reputation too damaged to maintain his former standing in major medical centers. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd started therapy, whether from genuine desire to change or court order, I didn't know or care. His therapist had apparently suggested he'd been following patterns learned from his own father, repeating cycles of emotional unavailability and using success to mask deeper insecurities. Understanding the roots of his behavior didn't excuse it, but it provided context for how someone could become so disconnected from basic empathy. His role in Sophia's life had become minimal by his own choice, occasional birthday cards with generic messages and child support payments that arrived through the court system. She rarely asked about him anymore, her world filled with people who showed up consistently and loved her unconditionally. When she did mention him, it was usually in passing, observing that some kids had daddies who lived with them and others didn't. Her therapist had helped her understand that family came in many forms, all equally valid. On Sophia's 5th birthday, surrounded by friends from school and the chosen family I'd built, I reflected on how completely our lives had transformed. The luxury apartment and wealthy lifestyle I'd lost seemed irrelevant compared to the richness of our current existence. We lived modestly but joyfully, our small home filled with laughter, creativity, and the deep security that comes from genuine love rather than financial resources. The birthday party was simple, held in our neighborhood park with homemade decorations and a grocery store cake. But watching Sophia run with her friends, her face glowing with happiness, I realized this was worth more than any elaborate event money could buy. She was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her, not because of what her family could provide but because of who she was as a person. Rachel, my best friend who dragged me to that fateful charity gala years ago, had traveled from Boston to attend, bringing her own daughter for Sophia to play with. "Look at you," Rachel had said, watching me arrange paper plates. "You're actually happy. Not performing happiness for someone else, but genuinely at peace." She was right. Despite all the struggles, I'd found something I'd never had during my marriage: authenticity. I no longer had to perform the role of perfect wife or hide my struggles behind a facade of having it all together. This life, messy and imperfect and real, was mine in a way the previous one had never been. That evening after the party, as I tucked Sophia into bed, she'd looked up at me with serious eyes. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy come to see me anymore?" The question had come eventually, as I'd known it would. I'd taken a breath and answered with age-appropriate honesty. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that don't make sense to us. Your daddy has things he needs to work on by himself. But that's about him, not about you. You are so loved, sweetheart, by me and Grandma and all the people who were here today. She'd considered this carefully before responding. That's okay. I have you, and you never leave. Her simple statement held more wisdom than she knew. Consistency and presence mattered far more than grand gestures or material advantages. I'd kissed her forehead and promised, "Never, baby. I will always be here." As I'd turned off her light and closed the door softly, I'd felt the weight of that promise settle over me like a blessing rather than a burden. Walking back to the living room where my mother was cleaning up the last of the party debris, I'd found myself overwhelmed with gratitude for how everything had unfolded. The path had been brutal, forcing me to confront painful truths about my marriage and fight battles I'd never imagined facing. But it had also revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed and connected me with people whose support had literally saved my life. Victoria had become more than just my attorney, checking in regularly to see how we were doing and celebrating each milestone. Jennifer's friendship provided understanding that no one else could offer, both of us carrying scars from Derek's manipulation but refusing to let them define our futures. My mother's unwavering presence had given Sophia a sense of family continuity that my failed marriage couldn't provide. These relationships, forged through crisis and maintained through genuine care, formed a support network stronger than any nuclear family structure. The hospital where I worked had recently offered me a position in their nursing education program, training new pediatric nurses. The role came with better hours, allowing me to be home for Sophia's bedtime every night, and a salary increase that would finally let us move to a slightly larger apartment. I'd accepted immediately, excited about the opportunity to shape the next generation of nurses while maintaining direct patient care a few shifts per month. Standing in our small kitchen that night, washing dishes while my mother dried them beside me, I'd realized that Derek's attempt to buy me out of Sophia's life had been the catalyst for discovering who I truly was. His assumption that I could be purchased, that my love for my daughter had a price, had revealed more about his character than any testimony in court. The fact that he'd offered money rather than working to become a better father showed exactly where his priorities had always been. 3 days after he'd slid that envelope across the table with such confidence, the recordings and testimonies had begun dismantling everything he'd built. His arrogance had been his downfall, his certainty that I was too weak and desperate to fight back. He'd underestimated the strength that comes from fighting for someone you love more than yourself. He'd forgotten that mothers have been moving mountains for their children since the beginning of time, and no amount of money or power could compete with that force. As I finished the last dish and hugged my mother goodnight, I'd thought about all the women still trapped in situations like mine, convinced they had no options because their partners controlled everything. I'd decided to start volunteering with Victoria's Legal Aid Clinic, offering support to mothers navigating custody battles against wealthy, powerful men. My story could provide hope to women who needed to know that fighting back was possible, that justice sometimes prevailed even when the odds seemed impossible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.